Long before he saved the universe, Robert Downey Jr. couldn't even save himself. His departure from Ally McBeal wasn't a creative choice, but a public self-destruction. This video exposes the era when Hollywood's most talented actor traded a Golden Globe for a prison jumpsuit. He was the savior of season 4 on camera, but a hopeless junkie behind the scenes. This is the story of Inmate P50522, the man who lost everything to a dirty burger and a heroin addiction. Robert Downey Jr. was born on April 4, 1965, into a lineage of eccentrics. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was not a man who could be defined by the conventional metrics of fatherhood. He was the prince of the underground, a maverick filmmaker whose movies, like Putney Swope, were absurdist, anti-establishment, and deeply cynical satires of American life. He was a man who viewed normalcy as a disease. His mother, Elsie, was an actress, a muse, and a woman who struggled to keep her footing in the hurricane of her husband's creativity. For the young Robert, affectionately known as Bob or Junior, childhood was not a sequence of Little League games and family picnics. It was a masterclass in bohemian chaos. The Downey household was a revolving door of the 1960s intelligentsia. At any given hour, the living room might be occupied by radical poets, experimental actors, or drug dealers. The air was perpetually thick with the sweet, pungent smell of marijuana and the acrid smoke of tobacco. Alcohol flowed like water. To be a child in this environment was to be an observer of adult vices before you could even tie your own shoes. Robert was precocious, wide-eyed, and desperate for connection. He worshipped his father. To him, Robert Sr. was a god, a tall, imposing, brilliant figure who commanded the attention of every room he entered. But Robert Sr. was a flawed god. He was an addict himself, a man who believed that altered states of consciousness were necessary for artistic truth. He loved his son, but he loved him with the reckless, dangerous affection of a man who didn't know where the boundaries of safety began. The original sin of Robert Downey Jr.'s life, the moment that would dictate the next 30 years of his existence, occurred on a nondescript evening in 1971. Robert was 6 years old. The loft was filled with people. The music was playing. Robert, mimicking the adults he idolized, was wandering through the party, sipping a glass of white wine. His father saw him. In a traditional household, a father would snatch the glass away, scold the child, and send him to bed. But Robert Downey Sr. operated on a different frequency. He watched his 6-year-old son drinking alcohol and felt a strange, misguided impulse. He later recounted that he thought it was hypocritical to let the boy drink wine but not experience the purer high of cannabis. So he did the unthinkable. He lit a joint. He called his son over, and he passed the marijuana to the 6-year-old boy. Robert took a drag. Decades later, looking back on that moment from the wreckage of his adult life, Robert Downey Jr. would not describe it with anger. He would describe it with a heartbreaking clarity. He said, when my dad and I would do drugs together, it was like him trying to express his love for me in the only way he knew how. This is the key to the entire tragedy. For Robert, intoxication was not rebellion. It was affection. The feeling of being high was chemically bonded to the feeling of being loved by his father. Drugs became the emotional currency of their relationship. To get high was to be close to dad. To be sober was to be exiled. This psychological association was soldered into his developing brain before he could read or write. The poison wasn't just a chemical, it was a warped form of paternal embrace. But amidst the toxicity, there was also the undeniable spark of genius. Robert was a born performer. He had to be. In a house full of loud, competitive artists, the only way to get attention was to be louder, funnier, and more dramatic than everyone else. He learned to mimic, he learned to dance, he learned to wear masks. His acting debut came at the age of 5 in his father's 1970 film, Pound. The premise of the film was bizarre, even by underground standards. Actors played dogs, waiting in a pound to be euthanized. Robert was cast as a puppy. It creates a surreal and unsettling image. A 5-year-old boy, surrounded by adults pretending to be dogs, acting out a script about death. He had one line of dialogue, a line that seems almost prophetic in its adult absurdity. He looks up at another character and asks, "Have any hair on your balls?" It was a laugh line. The adults on set roared. The audience in the village cinemas chuckled at the precocious kid. But looking back, it was a violation of innocence disguised as art. Robert was being thrust into an adult world, forced to speak adult words, existing in a space where childhood was just a costume to be worn for a scene. He wasn't a child. He was a prop in his father's surrealist vision. By the mid-1970s, the Downey family moved to Santa Monica, California. The setting changed from the gray grit of New York to the sun-bleached pavement of the West Coast. But the chaos remained. The marriage between Robert Sr. and Elsie was disintegrating, fueled by addiction and instability. They divorced in 1978. Robert, now 13, was given a choice: stay in California with his father or go back to New York with his mother. He chose his father. He chose the drugs. Santa Monica High School in the late 70s and early 80s was a playground for the rich and famous. Robert's classmates included future stars like Sean Penn, Rob Lowe, and Emilio Estevez. But Robert was different. He wasn't just a rich kid partying. He was a veteran of the drug culture. While other kids were experimenting with beer behind the bleachers, Robert was already a connoisseur of marijuana and cocaine. He was the life of the party, the class clown, the kid who would do anything for a laugh. But beneath the bravado, the cracks were forming. He was failing his classes. He was skipping school to get high. The bonding exercises with his father continued. They were roommates, conspirators in a lifestyle that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Robert Sr. was struggling with his own career, his own demons, and he was dragging his son down with him. Yet the talent was undeniable. It was a force of nature that could not be suppressed by the chemicals. Robert joined the Stage Door Manor Performing Arts Training Center in upstate New York during the summers. It was here, away from his father, that he flourished. He realized he had a gift. He could command a stage. He could make people cry as easily as he could make them laugh. He had a kinetic, nervous energy, a Chaplin-esque physicality that mesmerized audiences. In 1982, at the age of 17, Robert made a decision that would seal his fate as an artist. He dropped out of Santa Monica High School. He packed a bag and moved back to New York City to live with his mother. He was going to be an actor. He was hungry. He was brilliant. And he was already an addict. The New York he returned to was not the playground of his childhood. It was a gritty, dangerous metropolis. He bussed tables, worked at a shoe store, and lived in a tiny apartment scraping together money for auditions. But the drugs were always there. They were the background noise of his life, the hum of the refrigerator that you stop noticing until it stops. He began to land roles, small theater productions, off-Broadway shows. He was magnetic. Casting directors saw it immediately. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a puppy dog sadness that contrasted sharply with his razor-sharp wit. He was a paradox, an old soul in a young body, a wise-cracking cynic who desperately wanted to be loved. In 1985, at the age of 20, he landed a spot on Saturday Night Live. It should have been his big break. SNL was the holy grail for young comedians, but the 1985 season is widely considered one of the worst in the show's history. Robert, miscast and struggling to find his voice in the sketch format, was labeled the worst cast member in history by Rolling Stone magazine. It was a public failure. It stung, but failure for an addict is just another excuse to use. He retreated into the nightlife of New York. The clubs became his second home. He was charming, he was beautiful, and he was high. He met Sarah Jessica Parker on the set of the film Firstborn. She was clean, driven, and stable. She fell in love with him, believing she could save him. She became the first in a long line of people who would try to pull Robert Downey Jr. back from the ledge, but the poison planted by his father was deep in the soil. It wasn't just a habit, it was his identity. He didn't know who he was without the drugs. Was he the genius actor, or was he just the high-functioning son of an underground filmmaker? As the 1980s progressed, Hollywood began to call. The Brat Pack era was dawning. They needed young, pretty faces to play the angst-ridden teenagers of affluent America. Robert fit the bill perfectly. He had the look, he had the swagger, and he had the darkness. He moved back to Los Angeles, the city of angels and demons. He was about to enter the most prolific and destructive phase of his early career. He was about to become a star. But the shadow of the 6-year-old boy with a glass of wine was always there, walking just one step behind him, waiting for the moment to take the wheel. The puppy had grown up, but the collar was tighter than ever. The mid-1980s in Hollywood was a period of neon-soaked excess, a time when the industry was pivoting away from the gritty realism of the 70s toward high-concept blockbusters and teen comedies. Into this polished, superficial world walked Robert Downey Jr. He was 20 years old, fresh from the bruising failure of Saturday Night Live, but possessed of a kinetic energy that set him apart from his peers. He landed roles in films like Tough Turf and Weird Science, playing the eccentric sidekick, the guy who stole the scene by simply raising an eyebrow. He was charming the pants off Hollywood, quite literally. But beneath the cheeky grin and the rapid-fire dialogue, the chemical architecture of his brain was beginning to buckle. The casual drug use of his childhood, the bonding with his father, had graduated into a full-blown lifestyle. He wasn't just partying, he was self-medicating a profound restlessness. In 1987, the script arrived that would change his life, not because it made him a superstar, but because it terrified him. The film was Less Than Zero, based on the nihilistic novel by Bret Easton Ellis. The role was Julian Wells. Julian is a rich, beautiful boy from Beverly Hills who has everything and nothing. He is a drug addict who spirals into prostitution and death, destroying everyone who loves him. When Robert read the script, he felt a chill go down his spine. It wasn't just a character, it was a mirror. The performance he delivered is harrowing to watch even today. It is raw, ugly, and sweating with authenticity. Robert wasn't acting. He was channeling his own future. He later admitted that Less Than Zero was the ghost of Christmas, future visiting him. He famously said, "I played that character and then I became that character." The film was a critical success, praising Robert's depth, but for him, it was a psychological turning point. The line between the drug addict character and the drug addict actor vanished. The drugs he used to get into character, cocaine, heroin, didn't stay on the set. They came home with him. The prophecy of Julian Wells began to manifest in his real life. He was becoming erratic, He was missing appointments. The functioning part of the addict was starting to glitch. Yet, amidst this descent, there was a powerful anchor holding him back from the abyss: Sarah Jessica Parker. For 7 years, she was his protector. She was the one who pulled him out of bed for auditions. She was the one who drove him home from the parties when he couldn't stand. She loved him with a fierce maternal intensity, believing that her love could be the cure. With Sarah's stability, Robert managed to pull off the greatest magic trick of his career. In 1992, director Richard Attenborough was looking for an actor to play the most famous man in the history of cinema, Charlie Chaplin. It was an impossible role, but Attenborough saw something in Robert, a Chaplin-esque sadness behind the manic energy. Robert threw himself into the role with an obsessive fervor. He hired a coach to teach him how to play tennis left-handed. He learned the violin. He studied hours of silent film footage. It was a physical transformation that rivaled De Niro in Raging Bull. For a brief window, the work saved him. The discipline required to play Chaplin forced him to curb the drug use, to focus the beam of his talent. The result was a masterpiece. The Academy agreed, and Robert Downey Jr. was nominated for the Oscar for Best Actor. He had the world at his feet. He had the respect of his peers. He had the love of a good woman. But the moment the camera stopped rolling, the discipline evaporated. The post-Chaplin era was a slow-motion car crash. The sheer effort of keeping it together for the film had exhausted him. He felt he had earned a release. The drug use returned harder and faster than before. Cocaine was no longer enough. Black tar heroin became the drug of choice. Heroin is a jealous lover. It demands everything. Sarah Jessica Parker, after years of fighting a war she couldn't win, finally reached her breaking point. She left him in 1991. It was a devastating blow. Without her, the guardrails were gone. By 1995, Robert Downey Jr. was a walking contradiction. On screen, he was brilliant. Off screen, he was decaying. The industry knew. Directors began to hesitate. Insurance companies began to raise their premiums. Then came the year of the collapse, 1996. It began with a speed limit violation and ended with a gun. In June 1996, Robert was driving his black Porsche down the Pacific Coast Highway. He was speeding. He was naked. He was hallucinating. When the police pulled him over, they found a stash of heroin, cocaine, and a loaded .357 Magnum revolver in the car. It was a suicide kit on wheels. He was arrested, humiliated, and plastered across the tabloids. But he made bail. And making bail when you are in a psychotic break is dangerous. A few weeks later, under the influence of a potent cocktail of substances, Robert wandered out of his house in Malibu. In his delirium, the world was a blur. He walked down the street. He saw a house that looked like his. He walked in. The door was unlocked. He didn't steal anything. He simply walked past the living room, entered a child's bedroom, climbed into the bed, and passed out. This is the infamous Goldilocks incident. Imagine the horror of the homeowner. A mother walks into her 11-year-old son's room and finds a strange man passed out in the sheets. It isn't a burglar. It's the star of Chaplin. He was so catatonic that they couldn't wake him. They had to call the paramedics. They had to call the police. Robert was dragged out of the house in handcuffs, bewildered, drooling, completely detached from reality. The image of the golden boy was shattered. He wasn't a movie star anymore. He was a cautionary tale. He was hauled before a judge. The legal system, usually lenient on celebrities, was horrified. They ordered mandatory rehab. He escaped the rehab center within days, climbing out a window in his Hawaiian shirt. and hitchhiking back to Malibu. He was arrested again. It was in the courtroom in late 1996 that Robert Downey Jr. delivered the line that would define his struggle forever. Standing before Judge Lawrence Mira, looking small and terrified in his jail jumpsuit, he tried to explain why he couldn't stop. He didn't make excuses. He offered a glimpse into the hell of his own mind. "It's like I have a shotgun in my mouth," he told the hushed courtroom, "and I've got my finger on the trigger, and I like the taste of the gunmetal." It was a terrifying admission. He was telling the world that he was suicidal. He was telling them that the addiction wasn't about fun. It was about a compulsion to die. He loved the danger. He loved the proximity to the end. The judge looked at the genius standing before him and realized that probation would kill him. If he let Robert go, he would be dead within a week. So Judge Mira made a decision that shocked Hollywood. He sentenced Robert Downey Jr. to 3 years in the California state prison system. The gavel came down. The Oscar nominee was handcuffed. He was stripped of his name and given a number. The Golden Tramp was going to Corcoran. The prophecy of Julian Wells had been fulfilled. Robert Downey Jr. had become less than zero. The sound of a prison transport bus is a specific mechanical groan. It is the sound of metal grinding against metal, of air brakes hissing, of a heavy engine straining under the weight of human failure. In August 1999, Robert Downey Jr. sat shackled in the back of one of these buses, watching the scorched landscape of California's Central Valley roll by through a wire mesh window. He was 34 years old. He was an Academy Award nominee. He was the father of a young son, and he was on his way to hell. The destination was the California Substance Abuse Treatment Facility and State Prison in Corcoran. Do not let the sterile name fool you. This was a level 2 to level 4 maximum security penitentiary. It was a concrete fortress designed to hold the most dangerous men in the state. Its most famous resident was Charles Manson. And now, walking through the intake gates, stripped of his Armani suit and forced into a denim blue jumpsuit, was the man who had played Charlie Chaplin. Upon entry, the Hollywood star ceased to exist. Robert Downey Jr. was erased from the ledger. In his place stood Inmate P50522. The dehumanization was immediate and absolute. In later interviews, Robert would describe the experience of prison as the deepest level of sanding. It scraped away every layer of ego, every pretension of fame, leaving only the raw, terrified animal underneath. He was assigned a cell that was smaller than the bathrooms in the mansions he used to frequent. The air smelled of industrial cleaner, sweat, and fear. Celebrity in prison is a double-edged sword. Robert was not protected. He was placed in the general population. He had to navigate the complex racialized politics of the prison yard, where a wrong look or a misplaced word could result in a shiv to the ribs. He was forced to learn the currency of survival. He wasn't the funny guy from Saturday Night Live here. He was fresh meat. There are stories from this period that chill the blood. Reports surfaced of Robert waking up in a pool of his own blood after being attacked by fellow inmates. He spoke of gladiator days, times when the violence in the yard was so palpable you could taste the adrenaline in the air. To earn his keep, the genius actor was assigned to the prison kitchen. For 8 cents an hour, Inmate P50522 stood over industrial sinks, scrubbing vat after vat of congealed grease from pans used to feed thousands of convicts. Imagine the psychological vertigo. A man who had commanded millions of dollars per film, whose hands had held BAFTA trophies and Golden Globes, now submerged in lukewarm, dirty water, scrubbing for pennies. He served slop to murderers and rapists. He cleaned the latrines. He did it without complaint because in Corcoran, complaining gets you killed. But the most agonizing part of prison wasn't the work or the fear. It was the separation. He missed his son, Indio. He missed the simple dignity of being a free man. He wrote letters that were heartbreaking in their humility. He wasn't asking for a script. He was asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a second chance at being a human being. In August 2000, after serving nearly a year of his sentence, a miracle happened. An appellate court ruled that the judge had made a sentencing error regarding time served in previous rehab stints. Robert Downey Jr. was unexpectedly released on bail pending a hearing. He walked out of Corcoran State Prison a free man. He was 35. He was thinner, harder, and haunted. He had $500 in his pocket and a reputation that was radioactive. The industry had written him off. He was a felon. He was a liability. But Hollywood is a town of gamblers, and television producer David E. Kelley was holding a losing hand. His hit show, Ally McBeal, was entering its 4th season, and the ratings were sagging. The show needed a spark. It needed a dangerous, charismatic male lead to banter with Callista Flockhart. Kelley looked at the mugshots of Robert Downey Jr. and saw exactly what he needed. It was a massive risk. The studio executives were terrified. The insurance companies refused to bond him. But Kelley insisted. He hired Robert to play Larry Paul, a mysterious, intelligent, and deeply charming lawyer who sweeps Ally off her feet. The impact was seismic. From the moment Robert stepped onto the set of Ally McBeal, the energy shifted. He wasn't just acting. He was channeling a manic, desperate brilliance. The ratings skyrocketed. Critics who had written Robert's obituary were forced to write raves. He was the comeback kid. In January 2001, just months after scrubbing pots in Corcoran, Robert Downey Jr. stood on the stage at the Golden Globe Awards. He was wearing a tuxedo. The room was on its feet, applauding. He had won Best Supporting Actor. He held the gold statue up to the light, flashed that trademark smirk, and thanked the Hollywood foreign press. To the world watching at home, it was the perfect redemption arc. The sinner had been punished, he had repented, and now he was restored to glory. But it was a lie. Decades later, Robert would admit the terrifying truth about that night. He wasn't sober, he was high. He described that entire period on Ally McBeal as a waking coma. He said, "The only thing I cared about was when I could get back to the hotel and use." He looked at the Golden Globe in his hand and felt absolutely nothing. It was just a piece of metal. It meant nothing compared to the heroin waiting for him in his trailer. The addiction hadn't been cured by prison. It had merely been paused. And now, with money in his pocket, the adoration of the public, and the pressure of a weekly TV show, the demon was feeding with a vengeance. The crash came swiftly, and it was humiliating. In November 2000, police in Palm Springs raided a hotel room after an anonymous tip. They found Robert Downey Jr. alone, surrounded by cocaine and Valium. The studio panicked but managed to keep him on the show, hoping it was just a slip. But the shotgun in the mouth was still loaded. In April 2001, the final blow landed. Police in Culver City found a man wandering down an alleyway. He was barefoot. He was filthy. He was muttering to himself. He looked like a homeless person. When they approached him, they realized it was the star of America's #1 TV show. He was arrested on suspicion of being under the influence of a controlled substance. This time, there was no saving him. The producers of Ally McBeal had run out of patience. They had shot episodes for the season finale where Larry Paul proposes to Ally. It was supposed to be the happy ending the audience wanted. Instead, David E. Kelly ordered the scripts rewritten. Robert Downey Jr. was fired. Larry Paul didn't marry Allie. He simply vanished from the show. The fallout was catastrophic. It wasn't just a lost job. It was a total excommunication. His wife, Deborah Falconer, who had stood by him through the arrests, the prison sentence, and the relapses, finally reached her breaking point. She filed for divorce. He lost his role in the high-profile film America's Sweethearts. He was set to play the lead in a stage production of Hamlet directed by his friend Mel Gibson, but he lost that too. But the most devastating consequence was invisible to the public. In Hollywood, talent is currency, but insurance is the bank. After the Culver City arrest, the insurance companies of Hollywood blacklisted Robert Downey Jr. They declared him uninsurable. No bond company would cover a production that hired him. The risk was too high. He was considered damaged goods, a liability greater than an earthquake or a fire. By the summer of 2001, Robert Downey Jr. was 36 years old. He was a felon. He was divorced. He was unemployed. He was homeless, bouncing between cheap rentals and friends' couches. And he was legally unemployable in the only profession he knew. The genius was gone. The charm was gone. Only the junkie remained. In the lexicon of Hollywood, there are words that can kill a career. Difficult is survivable. Flop is forgivable. But uninsurable is a tombstone. For 2 years, one of the most gifted actors in American history sat in a rented room, listening to the silence of a phone that used to ring off the hook. He was a pariah. Even directors who worshipped his talent were powerless to help him. Woody Allen fought the studio to cast Robert in Melinda and Melinda, but the insurance underwriters simply said no. He was surviving on the charity of friends, doing voiceover work that didn't require insurance, and slowly suffocating under the weight of his own wasted potential. But rock bottom, as Robert would discover, is not a place you stay. It is a place you must inspect before you can leave. And his inspection came on Independence Day weekend, 2003, in the form of a fast food burger. The Burger King incident has become a piece of Hollywood folklore. Robert was driving a car loaded with drugs. He was high but not euphoric. He was in that terrifying state of maintenance addiction where the drugs no longer get you high. They just keep you from screaming. He pulled into a Burger King, ordered a burger and a soda, and took a bite. In that moment, a sensory short circuit occurred. The burger was disgusting. It was greasy, heavy, and tasted of ash. But it wasn't the food that was the problem. It was his body. The drugs had so ravaged his chemistry that he could no longer taste the simple pleasure of a cheap meal. He realized with a sudden horrifying clarity that he was dead. He was a walking corpse who couldn't even enjoy a burger. He looked at the burger, he looked at the ocean, and then he looked at the stash of drugs in his passenger seat. Something broke, or perhaps something healed. Robert Downey Jr. drove down to the water's edge. He took every pill, every bag of powder, every vial of liquid ruin he possessed, and he threw them into the Pacific Ocean. He watched them sink. It wasn't a dramatic movie scene with swelling violins. It was a desperate, quiet act of survival. He decided in the parking lot of a fast food joint that he was done dying. But deciding to be sober and getting hired are two different things. He was still uninsurable. He needed a miracle. And that miracle arrived in the form of an old friend, Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson and Robert had bonded on the set of Air America in the 1990s. In 2003, Gibson was producing a film called The Singing Detective. He wanted Robert for the lead role. The insurance companies laughed. So Mel Gibson did something that is virtually unheard of in the cutthroat world of Hollywood. He reached into his own pocket. He told the insurance companies, "I will personally underwrite the liability." If Robert didn't show up, if Robert got high, Mel Gibson would pay for it all out of his own fortune. It was a gamble of millions of dollars on a man who had been found barefoot in an alley 2 years prior. It was the ultimate act of friendship. Robert got the part. He showed up to the set terrified, but Mel Gibson was there as a guardian. Robert delivered a performance that was raw and brilliant. The film sent a signal flare up to the industry. Robert Downey Jr. is back. He is sober. He can work. But one film does not erase a decade of chaos. His next opportunity came with the horror film Gothika, produced by Joel Silver. Silver was willing to hire Robert, but the terms were draconian. They withheld 40% of Robert's salary until the film was wrapped. If he messed up once, he lost nearly half his money. It was humiliating. A grown man, an Oscar nominee, being treated like a delinquent child on probation. But Robert took the deal. He had no choice. It was on the set of Gothika in Montreal that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Fate walked into the production office in the form of Susan Levin. Susan was a producer on the film. She was 29 years old, from a stable Jewish family, organized, disciplined, and utterly unimpressed by celebrity nonsense. When she first met Robert, she didn't see a heartthrob. She saw a weirdo. Robert, however, was thunderstruck. He saw in Susan the one thing he had never possessed: stability. She was the calm in the center of his storm. He pursued her with manic intensity. Finally, she agreed to a dinner. What started as a set romance blossomed into something profound. But Susan was not a fixer. She wasn't there to save him. One night, after Gothika wrapped, Robert felt the old urge. The demon whispered. He used. It wasn't a binge, but it was a slip. When he told Susan, expecting perhaps the usual cycle of tears and forgiveness, he got a wall of steel instead. Susan Levin looked him in the eye and delivered an ultimatum that would save his life. "I am not doing this dance with you," she told him. "If you do drugs again, I am gone. Forever. No second chances, no arguments. I will walk out that door and you will never see me again." It was a binary choice. The drugs or the girl. The chaos or the future. Robert Downey Jr. looked at the woman standing before him. He realized that she meant it. He realized that this was his last off-ramp before the cliff. He drove to the Pacific Coast Highway again. He stopped at a pullout. He threw the last of his stash into the ocean, and this time he didn't look back. He proposed to Susan Levin in November 2003. They were married in 2005. The uninsurable man had found his insurance policy. It wasn't a bond from a bank. It was a ring on his finger. Susan became his partner, his producer, and the architect of his resurrection. With Susan by his side, Robert began the slow, grueling climb back up the mountain. He took supporting roles in films like Kiss Kiss, Bang Bang, and A Scanner Darkly. He was rebuilding his reputation brick by brick. He was working. He was happy. But he was still a niche actor. The blockbusters were for men like Tom Cruise or Will Smith. Robert Downey Jr. was too old, too weird, and too damaged to ever lead a franchise. Or so everyone thought. In 2006, a director named Jon Favreau was engaged in a gamble of his own. He was trying to launch a new film studio called Marvel. He had the rights to a B-list superhero character, a rich alcoholic industrialist in a metal suit. He needed an actor who could play arrogant, broken, and brilliant all at the same time. Favreau looked at the comic book panels of Tony Stark. Then he looked at the mug shots of Robert Downey Jr. and he smiled. To appreciate the sheer lunacy of what happened in 2006, one must first dismantle the modern image of Marvel Studios. Today, Marvel is a cultural monolith, but in the mid-2000s, Marvel Entertainment was a desperate, scrappy company operating out of a nondescript office above a Mercedes dealership. They had sold off their crown jewels, Spider-Man, X-Men, Fantastic Four, to avoid bankruptcy. They were left with the B-list characters. In a final terrifying roll of the dice, they mortgaged the rights to these remaining characters to secure a $525 million loan. The plan was suicidal: start their own studio, make their own movies. If the first movie failed, they would lose everything. They needed a hit. They needed a hero. And for their opening salvo, they chose Iron Man. On paper, Iron Man was a terrible choice to launch a franchise for children. Tony Stark was a middle-aged alcoholic arms dealer. He was a merchant of death. Jon Favreau realized that to make Stark work, he didn't need an action star. He needed a man who understood the architecture of regret. He needed a man who knew what it felt like to have a hole in his chest that could never be filled. He looked at the list of safe, insurable Hollywood leading men. Then he threw the list in the trash. He wanted Robert Downey Jr. The reaction from the Marvel executives was visceral. They were horrified. To the suits in New York, Robert Downey Jr. was not a movie star. He was a walking liability. He was the Burger King guy. The board famously told Favreau, "Under no circumstances are we prepared to hire him for any price." But Jon Favreau was stubborn. He argued that Tony Stark's superpower wasn't the suit. It was his redemption. And who knew more about redemption than Robert? The stalemate was broken by a compromise that was humiliating for an actor of Robert's tenure. He would have to screen test. The footage of that screen test is now legendary. Robert walked into the room wearing a tuxedo. He didn't just read the lines, he attacked them. He was loose, dangerous, and impossibly charming. In 3 minutes, he dismantled the skepticism of the room. He wasn't playing Tony Stark, he was Tony Stark. Marvel had no choice. The talent was undeniable. They offered him the role, but the terms were insulting. He was paid $500,000, a fraction of what his co-star Terrence Howard received. It was prove it money. Filming began in 2007, and it was chaotic. The script was unfinished. The plot was being written on the fly. But the most profound parallel occurred in the narrative itself. In the film, Tony Stark is captured by terrorists and trapped in a cave. To survive, he has to build a suit of armor from scraps. He has to forge a new heart to keep the shrapnel from killing him. For Robert, the metaphor was blindingly obvious. The cave was prison. The shrapnel was addiction. The suit of armor was sobriety. When Iron Man premiered in May 2008, the world was expecting a B-movie comic book flick. What they got was a cultural phenomenon. The film opened to $98 million in its first weekend. Critics were ecstatic. They recognized that they were watching something rare, the perfect alchemy of actor and role. Robert Downey Jr. didn't disappear into the character disappeared into him. The final scene of the movie was an ad-lib that changed cinema history. In the script, Tony Stark was supposed to read a prepared statement denying he was the superhero. Instead, Robert looked at the press, paused, and said 4 words that would define the next decade of pop culture. "I am Iron Man." It was a declaration of identity. It broke the fourth wall. Robert was telling the audience, "I am back. I am the man in the metal mask. I have survived the fire, and I have come out stronger." Overnight, the pariah became the king. His salary jumped from $500,000 to $10 million. then $50 million, then $75 million. But the true victory of 2008 wasn't the box office. It was the validation. Iron Man proved that the tragedy was just the first act. The second act was the resurrection. However, as the accolades poured in and the Team Downey empire began to rise, one final ghost remained. The man who had started it all, the man who had handed him the joint at 6 years old, was watching from the sidelines. Robert Downey Sr., the Prince of the Underground, was now an old man, watching his son conquer the establishment he had spent his life mocking. The relationship between father and son, forged in poison, would need its own redemption before the story could truly end. By 2012, Robert Downey Jr. had achieved a level of fame that is difficult to quantify. He was the gravitational center of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But while Tony Stark was busy saving New York from alien invasions, Robert Downey Jr. was quietly engaged in a much more difficult act of salvation, saving his past. The first step in this bureaucratic exorcism occurred on Christmas Eve, 2015. For years, despite his massive success, Robert was still legally a felon. In a move that surprised many, Governor Jerry Brown issued a full and unconditional pardon to Robert Downey Jr. It wasn't a celebrity favor. It was a recognition of genuine rehabilitation. It legally erased the narrative of the junkie. Robert received the news quietly. He didn't throw a party. He simply accepted it as the closing of a chapter that had nearly killed him. However, the true emotional climax of his life was not found in a governor's decree or a box office record. It was found in the black and white footage of a documentary simply titled Senior. In the final years of his father's life, as Parkinson's disease began to ravage the old filmmaker's body, Robert decided to turn the cameras on their relationship. He produced Senior, a documentary that is less a biography and more a final confession. In the film, we see the two Roberts. They talk about the art, the chaos, and finally the drugs. It is a conversation that is excruciating in its honesty. Robert Sr. admits his regrets. He admits that he didn't know how to be a father without the chemicals. But Robert Jr. does not attack him. He does not blame him. Instead, he offers him grace. He acknowledges that without the chaos, he wouldn't have the resilience. He reframes the poison, not as a curse, but as a terrible, beautiful part of their shared DNA. When Robert Downey Sr. died in July 2021, the loop was closed. The boy who had played the puppy in Pound had grown up to bury the man who put him in the collar. He had survived the legacy of addiction and transformed it into a legacy of forgiveness. This emotional maturation bled into his final performance as Tony Stark. In Avengers Endgame, the character arc of Iron Man concludes. Stark, who began as a selfish, arrogant merchant of death, sacrifices his life to save the universe. The parallels were blinding. Tony Stark's final act is to snap his fingers and erase the threat, dying in the process. It was the death of the ego. For Robert, leaving the Marvel Universe was a similar kind of death. He was walking away from the safety of the suit, walking away from the biggest paycheck in history to finally just be Robert again. His final line in the franchise, "I love you 3000, became a global catchphrase. But few realized that the line didn't come from a scriptwriter. It was something Robert's own children said to him. It was a message from his real life. The stable, loving, sober life he had built with Susan, bleeding into the fiction. The man who once had a gun in his mouth was now defined by how much he was loved. If you drive down the Pacific Coast Highway today, past the cliffs of Malibu, where the black Porsche once careened out of control, past the Burger King, where a greasy sandwich saved a life, you are driving through the geography of a miracle. The story of Robert Downey Jr. is often cited as the greatest comeback in Hollywood history, but to call it a comeback is to minimize the sheer violence of what he endured. A comeback implies a stumble. Robert Downey Jr. didn't stumble. He fell off the face of the earth. He was dead. He was buried under a mountain of heroin, legal writs, and public shame. The industry had poured concrete over his career and written uninsurable on the headstone.